Nat King Cole was a legend, no question. Smooth, charming, and one of the most recognizable voices of the 20th century. But behind that golden voice, his life was more complicated than most people realize. By the early 1960s, Nat had everything you think a man could want, but personal happiness was a different story. His marriage to Maria Cole had grown strained, and the pressures of stardom were really starting to take a toll on him and the relationship. At this time, Nat King Cole's life was split in two. On one side, you had the polished image, the tuxedos, the smooth voice, the doting husband and father, but behind the curtain, things weren't nearly as perfect. Years of touring, performing, and living life in the public eye had put a distance between he and Maria. Nat was spending less time at home and more time on the road, and it was during one of those tours in 1963 that temptation came knocking. While on the road with his Sights and Sound show, Nat crossed paths with Gunilla Hutton, a young Swedish dancer who was only 19 at the time. And for Nat, who was already feeling disconnected from his marriage, Gunilla represented something new, something exciting, maybe even something he thought was missing. But before long, what started as an encounter backstage turned into something much deeper. He fell in love with her. Hey guys, this is Kanoa Speaks. We're diving into the archives to bring you the moments from history that shaped the R&B and soul genres. Let's set the scene. Now here's where it gets messy. Nat wasn't just casually seeing another woman. He was emotionally checked out of his marriage and was redirecting that energy into his new relationship. While Maria was at home, raising their children, holding it down, Nat was on the road, falling harder and harder for somebody else. And it carried on for years, even overlapping with the darkest part of his life, his cancer diagnosis. It's messed up, but that's what it was. It was threatening the very foundation of his marriage. Maria knew things weren't right. She felt distance, the coldness, the long stretches where he was absent, and it's hard not to imagine how isolating that must have felt for her. You know, knowing her husband was drifting away and giving his heart to somebody else. And this is one of those situations where there's really no clean way to look at it. On the surface, it's easy to say, let me first start by saying Nat was wrong. Okay? He was wrong. He betrayed his wife, plain and simple. But if you dig deeper, you see a man who was broken in multiple ways. Fame had pulled him away from home. The marriage was struggling. And instead of facing those issues head on, he ran towards somebody who gave him comfort in the moment. It doesn't excuse what he did. Like I said, it's messed up. That's what it was. What makes it even more complicated was the timing, which just poured gasoline on an already volatile situation. Legends, even icons, they deal with messy, very human flaws too. In Nat's case, those flaws followed him right up until the very end. And even as the affair began, he knew it was wrong. He knew what he was doing. He knew what he was doing was complicated, and soon those complications would explode in a way that nobody could ignore. Again, he messed up. I don't want to make it sound like I'm defending him. He messed up. And she was young. Gunilla was young. She was just 19. I'm not absolving her by any means. I mean, she knew the man was married, and even if he was lonely or struggling, involving somebody that young in an affair, involving somebody period is just wrong, but involving somebody that young in an affair is unfair to Maria and it's unfair to Nat. It shows that fame and desire don't erase the consequences of your choice. You're not untouchable. Aware that he had cancer, Nat King Cole thought he was recovering after the removal of his lung, but doctors said the disease had spread beyond his control. The doctors had finally gave him the kind of prognosis that would shake anybody to their core. They gave him months to live. But Nat King Cole wasn't the type to fold. He could have taken that time to rest, to quietly step away from the spotlight, but instead he chose to do the exact opposite. Against the doctor's advice, against the doctor's better judgment, against the weight of his diagnosis, he went right back into the studio. He poured what little time he had left into his final project, the album Love. It was as if he wanted to leave the world with one more reminder of the beauty and the grace that he stood for. One last gift for the fans who adored him. Even if his body was failing him, he wanted his voice to remain timeless. Along with fighting cancer, he was fighting to make sure the world never forgot what he brought to it. And that's kind of a bittersweet moment. On one hand, it's devastating to think about him getting the news that way and to think about how unfair that was. But also, on the other hand, you got to think about how unfair it must have been to his wife to find out that he was cheating on her on his deathbed. And also, you got to think about how incredibly powerful it is about the way he responded before the cancer really caught up to him. He turned that tragedy into an album. He turned that tragedy into motivation. Instead of letting the cancer silence him, he made sure his voice would echo forever. By late 1964, Nat's secret life was becoming harder to manage. In January 1965, already weakened by lung cancer, he still felt compelled to reach out to Gunilla. He sent her a love letter and even $5,000. Now, Gunilla was unaware of Nat King Cole's health situation. So what she did, she made a phone call that changed everything. She called Maria, Nat King Cole's wife, and urged her to divorce him. Now, that phone call must have lit a fuse because Maria, who had long been aware of the tension in their marriage, confronted him in his hospital bed, in his deathbed. She was furious, and she had every right to be. In that hospital room, Nat had to face the consequences of his actions. He called Gunilla, chastised her for calling his wife, and ended the affair right then and there. He was dying, and he had to be with his family, point blank period. At the end of the day, fame, desire, and secrecy, all of that cannot outrun your mortality. He did what he had to do. He did what needed to be done, even if it was too late to change everything. And looking at this honestly, first and foremost, imagine being in Gunilla's shoes and you get a love letter and $5,000 and you have no idea that this man is sick. And if you were in her shoes, what would you do? I'm not saying she made the right move by calling the wife, trying to have a woman-to-woman conversation. You know, I wouldn't do no dumb stuff like that, but I'd probably call him and be like, hey, what's going on? You know, what's happening? I definitely think something was up. His situation is just messy because, I mean, eventually he had to take responsibility, right? I'm sure he wasn't on that deathbed making excuses like, oh, well, I'm on the road all the time and we on two different paths. And, you know, he had to take responsibility sometime. And like I said, Gunilla was only 19 years old and Maria had been his wife for decades. That affair had real consequences that hurt real people. Ending it and choosing his family at the end of the day was the right move, even if it came too late. Our choices have real consequences, and some lessons only hit when life gets serious. But that brings me to my next point. Long before Gunilla had ever came into the picture, Nat King Cole had already shown that his love life could get complicated. Let's take it back to his first marriage. Now, during his first marriage, Nat was married to Nadine Robinson. And on paper, everything looked fine. They had been together since the very start of his career, back when he was just a jazz pianist, hustling gigs, and nowhere near the global icon that he would become. Nadine had been there in those early years, but as Nat's star started to rise, so did the cracks in their relationship. Then here comes Maria Hawkins. Maria was a singer herself, performing with big bands and carving out her own lane in the music world. And when the two met, the spark was immediate. They had those kind of interactions where it didn't take months of build up. The chemistry was electric right away on night one. And Nat felt something different with her. Something he probably felt he couldn't ignore even if he was married. Nat eventually invited Maria to join him on the road. And here's the wild part. Maria knew he was married. She wasn't naive to the situation. She even admitted later on that she felt guilty about it, but clearly not guilty enough to walk away. And Nat was head over heels. It wasn't just like casual flings with him. This man falls in love with almost every woman he sees. And when that happens, the rest of the dominoes start to fall fast. Nat's marriage to Nadine couldn't survive that, and he filed for divorce. Only 6 days after divorce was finalized, Nat married Maria in what turned out to be one of Harlem's most talked about weddings. The wedding itself was huge, the second largest Harlem had ever seen at that time. Hundreds of people showed up. This was history. They tied the knot at the Belmont Plaza in a glamorous, extravagant ceremony. It should have been a night of nothing but joy, but it was also overshadowed by the harsh reality of racism in America at that time. The couple's first choice venue flat out refused to host the wedding because Nat and Maria were black. So even in that moment of celebration, Nat was reminded of the barriers he could never fully escape, no matter how famous he became. And you know, this part of Nat's story really shows you that he's no stranger to messy love situations. And ladies, I want y'all to listen up. You ready? Okay, here it is. If he cheated with you, he will almost certainly cheat on you. Pattern of leaving one relationship for another didn't start with Gunilla. It started way earlier with Maria. And when you put it into context, Maria at the hospital bed going off on Nat, while she had a right to do so, I don't feel bad for her one bit. On one hand, yeah, like Nat probably felt like he found a woman who lit him up in ways that Nadine didn't. And the same thing for Gunilla. It's complicated because the marriage to Maria gave him stability, it gave him children, it gave him years of partnership. But the way it began, as an affair, set the stage for the rocky chapters that would come later. After the confrontation at the hospital, Nat was forced to reckon with the life he had built and the mistakes that he had made. Maria was still by his side, but the distance between them had grown over the years. The affair with Gunilla had exposed cracks that weren't easily fixed, and Nat knew time was slipping away from him. Even as he battled lung cancer, Nat tried to hold on to some sense of control. He had to make peace with Maria, with Gunilla, and even with himself. Hell, he probably even made a call to Nadine and patched things up with her for all we know. I respect the fact that, at the very least, he explained to Gunilla why things had to end, emphasizing that his family is who needed him the most, especially at a time like that. He wasn't a perfect man, and nobody is. He hadn't always made the right decisions, but in the end, he tried to set things right, at least as much as he could before time ran out. And this really shows how complicated people really are. You know, he was talented, charming, flawed, sick. Facing the consequences of his choices is something everybody has to do eventually. I feel like this reminds me that waiting too long can hurt everybody involved. It doesn't erase his mistakes, of course, but it does show a man trying to make things right at the very end. To me, that's at least respectable. At least a little bit. In those final days, he had to confront realities that most people never really have to face. and the fact that no amount of wealth or charm could protect him from the inevitability of death. So if you got a woman at home holding it down for you, you got to make sure to hold her down. Nat King Cole spent what energy he had left ensuring that his children were taken care of, that Maria understood his intentions, and that he could leave behind something resembling somewhat of closure. Looking at his final days, it's impossible not to feel a mix of sadness and understanding, because he was a man who had achieved incredible things. Somebody whose music continues to inspire generations even now. Like I said, he's also human, he's flawed, he was often selfish and prone to decisions that hurt people that he loved the most. But with that being said, there's also something really authentic in the way he faced those consequences in his last days. He ended the affair. He tried to reconnect with his family. In a way, he was pretty much acknowledging his death was coming. Even if it doesn't erase the mistakes, even if it doesn't excuse them, it's a reminder that life is messy, man. Life is complicated. It's full of lessons that sometimes only hit us when time is running out. It only hits us at the end, when it's too late. Sometimes you don't get a storybook ending. Sometimes you don't get a happily ever after. Sometimes you can't fix it. Only the day before his death, Cole was taken for a short ride in his car by his wife, and a few days earlier he had visited his children briefly at the family home, an imposing brick mansion at 401 South Murrayfield Road in the Hancock Park district. Visitors were not permitted in Cole's 6th-floor hospital room, but the week before, when comedian Jack Benny was visiting another friend, he inquired about Cole, and the singer invited him in for a 15-minute chat. The first intimation of Cole's illness came during late fall of the previous year, where he was forced to cancel an engagement at the Sands in Las Vegas because of what was described as a respiratory ailment. On December 9th, 2 days before he was to have presented the inaugural popular music and jazz concert at the Music Center, he was taken to the St. John's Hospital, where x-rays disclosed his lung tumor. Cobalt treatments were initiated. Frank Sinatra substituted for him with an all-star cast as King Cole Salutes the Music Center drew a capacity crowd at the Pavilion on December 11th. When the serious nature of Cole's illness was disclosed, he was bombarded with mail, telegrams, and calls, more than had been received by anyone else in the hospital, which often has celebrity patients. Nat King Cole passed away on April 15, 1965 at the age of 45 years old. Even though people knew he was sick from lung cancer, it still shocked the world. Nat was a legend. A man whose voice everybody recognized and everybody loved. And yet behind all that fame and all that charm, his personal life had been very complicated, very messy, and full of tension right up until the very end. Fame doesn't erase your problems. And Nat's final year proved that in a very real, human way. When he finally passed, the world lost an icon. But his music is what endured. Songs like Unforgettable, songs like Mona Lisa, they all continue to resonate because they were not just about, the vocal skill or the production or, it was about the feeling. The emotion, the lived experience behind his words. Knowing that the human struggle behind Nat's music, the mistakes, the drama, and the love, they all make his voice feel even more real. His music carries the magic of the performance, the weight of the human life lived fully and with brilliance and with the flaws, with the mistakes, with the moments of grace, with all of that put together. When I look at his story, I see somebody who was extraordinary, but also, like I said, human. Very human. He made mistakes just like anybody else, and those mistakes hurt real people, and they had real consequences. But he also did try to take responsibility when it mattered the most, even at the very end. That's what makes him human. His music is timeless, but the man behind it was very real, very complicated. His life reminds us that brilliance doesn't mean perfection in any sense of the imagination. Even in the final moments, people have the capacity to reflect, to try to make amends, to try to leave a lasting impact through what they create. Cheers.